You know, when I was a kid, one of my favorite television shows was Gilligan's Island. Now, if you've never seen Gilligan's Island, it was about a group of people who were shipwrecked on this island. And there was one from about every different kind of social group you could imagine. You know, there was a millionaire and his wife, there was a professor, there was a movie star, there was a Kansas farm girl. So there were all these different people from all different walks of life, and they were all living on this island. And every week something else would happen. Sometimes an outsider would end up briefly on the island and then would get off at the end of the episode, or something would happen, and each one would react in their own way. And when each one reacted in their own way, you would see that they didn't just represent themselves, but they represented whatever part of society they were supposed to represent. So, for example, the Kansas farm girl represented Middle America. You know, the movie star represented celebrity, etc., etc. And I remember when I was a kid being a little confused by some parts of the show, not getting what was happening there exactly, and I would pepper my father. I remember one time I peppered my father with these questions, and he was getting very frustrated with my ridiculous questions. Like, for example, the millionaire had these big chests full of money, and I remember thinking, like, why doesn't he just have a checkbook that he carries with him? Who carries around big chests of money? You know, and so there were all these kinds of ridiculous things, and I was missing the point when I was a kid. I was missing the point that, in fact, Gilligan's Island was what we call a microcosm. What a microcosm is it's a small part of society that represents the bigger whole. And Gilligan's Island was originally conceived of as this comedic social commentary where each person represents a different segment of American society. And when someone comes from the outside into the society, they react not just in the personal way that their character might, but also in the way that that segment of American society might react, so that eventually we can see how they work out the problem that that character brings, and then we can sort of see from that maybe how America as a whole might do this. Gilligan's Island's hardly the only microcosm in popular culture. For example, almost any war movie, the platoon is going to be some kind of microcosm, in that case again of American society. You know, there's always the farm boy or the guy named Tex. There's always the guy from Brooklyn. You know, there's always the rich kid who could have gotten out of the draft, but he enlisted anyway. You know, there are all these different, you know, there's always the guy who's talking about what he's going to do when he gets home, and each one represents a different part of the culture. And even in lots of other ways that we don't think about, we like microcosms. So, for example, think of all these reality shows where they take supposedly ordinary people and they put them together in some kind of competition, or they just have them living together in a home together. That's a kind of microcosm. You know, you would never find this group of people all living together in the same house, or all in this same kind of situation. Instead, you're supposed to identify the people not as individuals necessarily, but as a representation of a particular social group. And even when you get outside of that kind of thing, even shows like The View, each of the women in The View, each one is supposed to represent a different segment of womanhood, based on their age, based on their race, based on some sort of vague association with social class. Although, let's face it, if they're on The View, well, they're all doing pretty well for themselves. These are all microcosms. And microcosms, like Gilligan's Island, always act as a kind of social commentary. Well, the Canterbury Tales is a kind of microcosm. Sometimes I'll see people who read the Canterbury Tales and they're trying to figure out certain things about the characters. You know, how did this knight go to all these different battles? How was that possible? You know, what did it mean? You know, how is it possible that all these different people, you know, if they're all together, this is a huge group, how can they hear one another telling the stories? But these kinds of questions really miss the point. Chaucer is not presenting this group as a group that would ever realistically be together, you know, in this way. Instead, he's taking a microcosm of his society. Each person represents not only themselves, but they represent a part of Chaucer's society. and he's commenting on that society. And so what Chaucer has done here with his general prologue and then each individual tale is really quite brilliant, because to begin with, each individual tale is a standalone. It exists on its own as a tale which you can understand. Then, when you understand that within the text of that tale's prologue, who's the teller? Why did they tell the story of that tale? Then suddenly you begin to see that tale in a different way than you might have before. And then with the general prologue, we see not just these individual portraits of the different pilgrims, but we also see places where there could be different kinds of conflict, and different places where this social group would have this interest and that social group would have that interest. And so not just in the general prologue, but the prologues between each tale give us a kind of interaction between the characters. And so we have an additional way that the stories can be read. They can be read by themselves, they can be read in the context of being told by that particular character, or they can be read in the context of, in essence, a dialogue among the characters. So, for example, the wife of Bath. You know, she has been married so many times, it's a number that would be wildly unrealistic. You know, it's possible that someone would be married that many times, absolutely. But is it likely? No. She represents sort of all married women, essentially. She's out looking for another husband. You know, all these widows who somehow have money to disposable income, and they're able to do these kinds of things. And so her story has an interest of its own, but it also tells us something about her and how she understands the world. Well, then, when we hear the Miller's Tale, and we realize that the character in the Miller's Tale, the female character, has the same name, Allison, as the wife of Bath, then we realize the Miller is actually saying something about the wife of Bath, something which, you know, which might be seen as in some way insulting, and it's starting a conversation between these two tales. And so, in a sense, the wife of Bath's tale is a response to the Miller's Tale. And as we move through all these different tales, each one can be read on these different levels. It can be read as a tale by itself. It can be read as a story being told by this character, as an interaction among these characters, and then finally, all of them together as this microcosm. Chaucer's looking at his culture, looking at his society, and saying, how does my society understand these issues? How does my society deal with these problems? And he's presenting them to us in a way that we're not supposed to think ever actually happened in that way, but rather in a way that gets at a deeper truth, a truth of social commentary.